Hello and welcome to another edition of Notes. I'm your host, Miss Pranky.
And I'm your co-host, Mr. Armson. Today we'll be talking about the evolution of populations.
Whoop whoop!
What is a species, you may ask? Well, it's a group of similar organisms that can breed and produce fertile offspring.
The key here is fertile offspring. So organisms can reproduce like a horse and a donkey. They produce a mule, but they are two separate species because the offspring is not fertile. So, how do species form? There are 4 different ways that species can form. The first one is through reproductive barriers. What this means is that they're either physically not capable of breeding or they have different mating habits.
All right, so for instance, like if you think about like spawning fish, those fish are different species of fish are going to spawn at different times based on the temperature of the water, so they're not all spawning at the same time. So that's kind of an idea of what a reproductive barrier would be.
Yes. Another example is separation. When two populations, so remember a population is a group of organisms that are the same species. So when we separate them by some type of geologic barrier, that can be a mountain, that can be a desert, that can be an ocean, exactly. Adaptive radiation is another way that species form. This is a really important concept that we need to understand because it's the emergence of many new species when a common ancestor is introduced into a new environment. We will talk about this in a little bit with the mass extinction of the dinosaurs. But what this is really saying is that if there are open niches available, organisms are going to occupy those niches because there's less competition. So we've kind of been saying that this whole unit. And then the last one is genetic drift, which we will go over some examples of genetic drift in a little bit.
All right. So reproductive isolation, ways to prevent breeding between two species.
So if you look at the picture here, you can see these are fruit flies. However, the one fruit fly breeds on a mango, I'm going to assume that is, and the other fruit fly breeds on bananas. So we're separating them based on where they reproduce.
Geographic isolation, physical barriers prevent interbreeding.
So that's going to be like mountain ranges or oceans, things that these organisms cannot cross. So if you look here, all these different geckos cannot cross this mountain range. I'm sorry if they're a lizard.
Oh, there's a salamander.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I knew you were going to get me for that. And then the last one is going to be behavioral isolation. These are going to be different behaviors that prevent interbreeding between species. This really has to do with birds. Birds do different types of dances and rituals in order to find a mate. All 3 of these are going to be examples of reproductive barriers.
All right, evolution is defined as a change in a population's gene pool over time. A population that is not evolving is at equilibrium.
Yes. So a gene pool, this goes back to genetics, one of our favorite units. A gene pool is going to be all of the different variations of phenotypes in that population. So if we look here, these are all different types of dogs. Dogs are the same species, but there are many different variations of it.
So 5 major causes of evolution. 1 is natural selection. 2, genetic drift. 3, migration. 4, mutations. And 5 is non-random mating.
So let's explore these 5 causes of evolution.
Great idea.
Thanks. The first one's going to be natural selection. Natural selection is going to occur when one allele is favored over other alleles.
So as we take a look at these graphs below, frequency of individuals in original population, we have a very lightly colored mouse, and then on the left, on the top graph, and then a very dark colored mouse on the far right. If you look at the middle, you can see that you have a medium colored mouse, which seems to be favored in that environment.
Yes. So you're still going to have many different variations of the trait. However, the one that's being favored is going to be the middle phenotype here. So if we look at the bottom, there are 3 different types of graphs that depict different types of natural selection. The first one is going to be directional selection. Okay, this one goes with the word directional. It's going to pick one direction to go in. So this is going to occur when one extreme phenotype is favored. Remember, phenotype means what they physically look like. So in this example, we're looking at beetles. This is going to be green beetles or tan beetles. In this example, the tan ones are going to be favored. So you can see the graph is going to start shifting to the right because that extreme phenotype is going to be favored.
All right, stabilizing selection occurs when the average phenotype is favored.
So that's going to be when the intermediate, so you can see the original populations is dotted line. This is going to be when you're favoring the middle of it. So majority of your population is going to look like that intermediate or the average phenotype.
Disruptive selection occurs when both extreme phenotypes are favored.
Yes.
So in this graph, you can see that on the both left and the right, you have extremes on both ends. However, it stabilizes in the middle. So if you're talking about like the mouse in the original slide, you're going to have a lighter colored mouse and a darker colored mouse. However, it stabilizes with the medium colored mouse in the middle and is preferred in that environment.
Right.
All right, go ahead.
So what type or what pattern of natural selection would be occurring here based on the three that we just talked about? We want you to answer this on your note sheet. We're going to give you a second before we answer it. So looking at this graph, on the left y-axis, we have the percent of births in population. So that's going to be the blue. And then the red is going to be the percent of infant mortality. So the graph that we want to look at here is going to be the blue one. So this is going to be stabilizing selection because that intermediate phenotype is favored here. The two extremes are being selected against.
So the reason why is because if you look at the far left, obviously having offspring that are undersized and maybe not as healthy, the likelihood of them surviving is not very good. And at the far right, if you have offspring that are overly large or too big and sometimes too healthy maybe, it risks the mother's mortality and the child. So therefore, she might not be able to deliver her child because of the size, thus putting both lives at risk. So what's being favored here is like the medium-sized baby in the end that's going to deliver a healthy, well-sized baby that ensures survival of both mother and child.
Exactly. So that's stabilizing selection for this one. So in this example, we want to figure out what type of natural selection is occurring. So what we have here on the left, we have a male. I don't know what type of fish
That's
this is.
That's a bluegill.
Thank you.
100%.
I was going to try and I knew you'd get upset with me if I was wrong here.
Treat.
Oh, it says it right there. Dang. So the left is going to be a male. The right fish is also going to be a male. This is called a mimic. And then in the middle is a female. So we have one extreme phenotype where the male is big and a different color. We have another extreme phenotype where the male is small and mimics the female. So what type of natural selection would this be? Disruptive selection. I want to give them a second.
Okay.
So make sure you put that on your note sheet. It's disruptive because we are favoring those two extreme phenotypes, either a very large male or a small mimic male.
Perfect. So what pattern of selection has occurred? Now we're taking a look at the number of cacti and the number of spines. And this is a collared peccary. It is a smaller pig that lives in the deserts of Texas, New Mexico, in the southwest United States.
Wow. I didn't know that either. You're so good at animal identification here.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. So the trait that's being favored here is more spines because it limits predation. So what type of natural selection would this be? It would be directional selection because we are favoring one extreme. So we're going one direction here.
So if you take a look at this graph, what's happening here is obviously the collared peccary is able to eat the preferred food in its environment, which is this cactus, but it prefers cactus with less spines. So right, if the cactus is producing more spines, the cactus then survives and is able to reproduce at larger numbers because of its protection against the collared peccary.
Yes. So the second driver of evolution is going to be genetic drift. Genetic drift is when there are changes in a population's gene pool due to chance events. So these are things that are random. These can be natural disasters. These could be like humans crushing bugs. It's more likely going to affect smaller populations, just because if it's a smaller population, you are able to wipe out that variation a little bit easier. So we have some examples of genetic drift.
So an example of genetic drift, a bottleneck effect. If a natural disaster kills many individuals in the population, survivors are a different representation than the original population.
So this happens after big extinction events, which we'll get to in a second when we get to that slide. But as we can see here, a bottleneck effect is going to be when you lose traits in your gene pool because of something happening and they are no longer represented in that population.
So think about it like this. If when you take a look at that image, all of these colored dots, whether they're yellow, blue, or white, are organisms within an environment. Catastrophic event happens. The ones that exit the actual bottle are the surviving members of the population, and thus changing the actual representation of the original population because of their makeup.
Yeah, so that yellow phenotype is lost in the surviving population.
Right.
The next example of genetic drift is going to be the founder effect. This is going to be when a small subgroup of a population migrates to a new location and that subgroup does not represent the original population. So looking here, we have different types of ladybugs. And the first A population only has this black and this yellow phenotype. They leave the original population and they go to a new area. They are no longer able to breed with population B, and so they become their own population. However, they lost that red variation. They no longer have that, even though they're still the same species. Population B lost that black phenotype, so they're no longer able to get it because they did not migrate with that new population.
Perfect. Mass extinctions and genetic drift have shaped the history of life on Earth. Yes, it has.
Yes, it has. This goes with the KT event. So this is what we were talking about earlier with adaptive radiation. Once that meteor struck the Earth, it covered the Earth in ashes and organisms were no longer able to survive. Their food was wiped out. The sun was no longer able to hit the Earth. So the small organisms that were able to survive, there were some mammals that survived it, and they were able to then, after all of that ash cleared up and the environment was kind of restabilizing, there were so many open niches available because so many organisms died. And based on that adaptive radiation process that we talked about, if there are open niches available, organisms will occupy them. So this allowed the diversification of those small mammals, and they just grew in number and in size because of all of those open niches available.
So when you think about those open niches that are available, life is always going to find a way then to compete for those niches, and then they're going to adapt in those niches and then take on those adaptations to survive in the best form of themselves, to reproduce and exist in those niches.
Yes. So the third type of driver for evolution is going to be migration. Migration is going to be the movement between populations changes in gene pool. So this is really important because we talked about before, you can't just change your genes. So how do you get new variations into a population? One example is going to be migration. So this is how you introduce new genes into that gene pool, which allows for better survival in case that environment changes.
Mutations, new alleles can arise by chance. And Ms. Prank and I were just talking about this. This is a really fascinating one because when we talk about by chance, this is really a form in which life is always finding a way to exist in an ever-changing environment.
Absolutely. The last one's going to be non-random mating. What this is that individuals pick the traits that they want in their mates. So every organism does this. Human beings, for example, fun one, they go by symmetry. The more symmetrical your face is, the more attractive and beautiful. Psychologists have actually done studies on this. So you're picking based on the symmetry of people's faces.
And if you take a look at those pictures, they all look alike. If you look at their mates, like there's similarities in which the male and the female really kind of look similar.
Yeah, they do. Not by chance. Another example of that is going to be sexual selection. Animals do this in the wild all of the time. All of these examples here show males using bright coloration. Females pick the males with the brightest color because that shows that they have the most nutrition. If they're brightly colored, that means that they're obviously being adequately fed. They're healthy. So the brighter the colors and the bigger, the more healthy they are, which is what they want for their offspring.
Coevolution, a series of reciprocal, so it's events that happen same time, adaptations in two species. A change in one species results in selection in another. So an example here would be a cheetah and a gazelle. Both species can run over 60 miles an hour. Obviously, we've talked about like that kind of biological arms race. If the prey species is outrunning its predator, it's going to be an issue for the predator, meaning its existence is going to be in question, right? So therefore, the cheetah has to be able to run fast to catch its prey for it to compete and then survive in advance.
Yes. And then our last example is going to be convergent evolution. This is going to be when two organisms develop similar traits due to similar environments, but they are not closely related. Okay, so this is going to be like our analogous structures. They have the same function, but it's not because of a common ancestor. So our example here is going to be bats and birds. They both have wings in order to fly, right? Their environment favors flying. This could also be anything in the ocean or in the water. They have fins and flippers in order to swim. The environment is selecting those favorable traits, but it is not because of a common ancestor. That's it for our notes today. Please submit them when you are done and let us know if you have any questions.
Yeah, please let us know. These are all really big ideas and can be studied. I mean, people study these for a lifetime,
yes.
Right? So if you have any questions about these or want to do some follow-up, please let us know.
Yes, and we are going to really study these in our next couple of activities that we do. So very important to understand this stuff.